Great. Thanks, guys. Yeah, we've got a couple questions here, and we'll go through them. And you know, for people who want to submit questions, also I would say if you have a particular question for Karen or for Larry, if you could just specify that in the question field, that would be great for me. Here's a question from Maureen, and I assume this would be one for Karen. She asks, what happens when clients move from a community property state like California after 15 years of marriage to an equitable distribution state, North Carolina, for example, recently?
Thank you for that question. So they recently moved from California, did you say, after 15 years?
Yeah, after 15 years of marriage to a equitable distribution state.
So there is the residency requirement of the 6 months. So most likely there would be more applicable to the California law at that point if they just recently moved. But with time, I mean, certainly, because it's very different with California, and of course I only practice in Massachusetts, so having to talk with people in California, but it is community property, 50-50 automatically. Certainly taking a different approach instead of going through the courts also would allow the couple to be able to see, and along with the program, to see what makes the most sense for them also. So there's different strategic ways of doing it. It really depends also on what makes sense for the clients too.
Right.
Hope that.
Okay, and I think this question is from Bob, and I think it's also probably directed towards you, Karen. He asks, can you please describe the typical items addressed in a prenuptial or post-nuptial agreement? Are the agreements binding? Can the agreement be challenged legally after being signed?
So great questions. Again, depends on the state that you are in, but in a prenup and also in a postnup, there's particular kinds of standards that are required elements. So usually in prenups and postnups, you make sure to define separate property and marital property. You also can talk about alimony, how it would be effective if you got divorced, what would be the outcome for alimony. Different kinds of pieces of retirement can be in there, but certainly it's smart too to think about prenups and postnups, because that conversation is good between couples to be able to do that. So certainly separate and marital property should be. It could also be addressed of what happens at divorce and what happens at death also. So it's a good estate planning tool to have it in there. Whether or not it's upheld, making sure that the different elements are required. In Massachusetts, there's certain elements such as fair and reasonable at the time that the agreement was entered and at the time of divorce, making sure that both parties have independent counsel, full financial disclosure, and post-nups more towards it's not in contemplation for divorce. So again, each state is different. There is a number of cases in different states that they have been upheld, as long as it's also not the night before the wedding and those kind of pieces. So hope that addressed the question.
Yeah, I think so. Here's another question for you, Karen. And if you need me to repeat it, I can. But this is from Stephen. He asks, in a special needs divorce action at the apportionment phase, would you accept the argument that the custodial parent's greater amount of time providing care has an economic value, which should be counted in the final determination?
Very good question. I think that it depends on each situation, but certainly that sort of goes back to what Larry was talking about. If one parent has spent more time raising the children, doing those kind of things, that should absolutely be taken into consideration. as one of the factors in that situation.
Right. Okay. We have a number of questions, Larry. This is sort of for you, from people asking, well, what does AMDS do versus MaxiFi do? Why can't I just set up an alternative profile in MaxiFi to run these things? Why would I necessarily need AMDS? Maybe you want to just talk about that?
Well, we thought through how to make it really easy to enter a divorce agreement, like, dealing with housing. If you had a license for MaxiFi for the husband and one for the wife, and you just ran them side by side, let's say on 2 laptops, so you could see the results, you could pretty much produce the same result as if you used AMDS. But AMDS is just convenient for a lot of things like, well, this spouse is going to stay in the house until this year, then they're going to move. And during that period, how are the expenses going to be shared? Or how much child support will there be? And who's making the child support payments to whom, for how long, for how much? It's just, catches all the issues. But I would say that you can run, anything that you can do in AMDS, you can do by running MaxiFi side by side. You could also get you could also get one version of MaxiFi, which is the Pro version, more expensive. It's like $500 for the first year for the license. And then you could set up yourself as one client and your spouse is another client. And then you can have, you can compare, and then you could have a third case where you're both married. So you could have like myself single is one client, my spouse single is another client. The third case is we're both married. And then we can compare the 3. And then for each person is single, you can think about different profiles. So we do this kind of allocation of the assets for one profile. We do it for the one spouse, for my spouse, for myself, and then we see what the outcomes look like. But it's going to be a little bit more cumbersome to do a comparison. You have to look on this screen and then on this screen to run this program, this profile, and then run this profile to see what the 2 living standards are and compare them, as opposed to an AMDS. You can see right on a side-by-side basis right away what the 2 living standards are. So I think AMDS is worth it. It's not that expensive compared to what lawyers would charge. And if you can avoid lawyers, that's a huge thing. I mean, Karen's case, she's a lawyer, but also a mediator. So the ideal thing is you're going to need a lawyer to help you with the doc. So if you could find a mediator like Karen, who's also a lawyer, who can do all the paperwork for you to help you with that, get all the notarization. She's also a notary. Man, it makes it so easy compared to having to deal with a whole bunch of different people. Anyway, I hope that's a good answer. Yep.
Well, and I think on that topic, this is from Suzanne, and I guess I'll kick it to Karen. If the divorce is contentious, how can any of this be used?
How can the mediation be used, or which part?
Well, how can basically the software, or looking at divorce, I guess using software to kind of equalize living standards, would it still be viable or relevant in a case where the divorce is contentious?
I mean, I'll answer first, and then I think Larry, you can hop in. But I think any kind of education and figuring out what would maybe be the outcome and then doing a comparison is always helpful. to have. As much education, information that you can get is really important. And if it has to start in litigation because it's contentious, there always is to use the software to use that information in trying to settle the situation. So it's a good tool in both ways. And then, you know, if you can try and settle it through different kinds of means, that's my personal, I think it's definitely worthwhile all the way around.
Yeah, I'll just pipe in that, you know, contentious divorce could be, I think I'm not getting treated fairly in terms of the settlement that you're proposing. Well, then if you run it through AMDS or both people in MaxiFi, you get to see exactly what the two living standards are, because the person who thinks they're being worked over might actually have it wrong. They might think they're going to have a living standard that's half as big as the other person, whereas it's, you know, much more equal, or it could actually be worse. So if you want to prove your point that you're not being treated fairly, this is the perfect software. But, you know, in the end, you want to know you're being treated, how you're being treated. You don't want to be guessing at it. And this is, I think, a way to point out to the other person, look, you're not treating me fairly. If it is very unequal, you're not. I run myself through this. You're in it too. Your living standards here, my living way up here, mine's way down here. That's not a reasonable outcome since we've been married for 20 years and I put you through grad school. You know, it's not going to fly with a judge, not in the state of Connecticut, maybe in Texas if you live in Texas, but not in Connecticut. And so let's be reasonable here. And that might be the path to getting to a solution. The other thing is that running this program or running the two, you know, MaxiFi both ways for both people, you immediately see that fighting and paying for lawyers become an expense in these programs. When you run them, you have to enter special expenses for lawyers. So if it becomes very clear very quickly that the more you spend on lawyers, the less you have for your own living standard for the rest of your life. So the idea of kind of fighting for fighting's sake, it's coming out of both parties' hides, and that's not always immediately obvious. You've got one person's a higher earner and the other person is a lower earner, and maybe that person's lower earner thinks that the harder they make it for the other person in terms of more dispositions with more interactions, meetings with lawyers, they're going to end up better off. Well, there's going to be less of a pie to split, more legal fees that are involved here. So I think there's also that value to using the software.
This is to Karen, but maybe Larry also wants to chime in. Karen, this is from Suzanne again. Karen, does the judge take these numbers into account? Also, thinking of someone who has been married for 7 years and has a 4-year-old child, if alimony is involved, does that go to age 18, and can that be taken into account?
It depends on the state that you're in. What was the first part of the question, sort of breaking it down?
The first part of that question really is, would a judge take these numbers into account? You know, you come in, you say, look, we've run this through the program. Does that actually stand?
I think you present it to the court as whether it's an exhibit or you have somebody like Larry who is an expert in the area to explain it. It could always be a chalk. Again, it depends on the judge. In Massachusetts, you have to fill out financial statements, and most states you do also. So that also helps the judge making the decision. If it is contentious and if you're going through litigation, then the judge has this information. The more you can give the judge, the better, to make that determination, the judge and the findings. So that I think is important. to absolutely, I don't know, Larry, if you feel.
Yeah, I do think that, I think judges are kind of at a loss. They're making kind of rules of thumb decisions. But, you know, if we're talking about a 45-year-old husband and a 45-year-old wife, if they get divorced, he's going to pay a certain, you know, path of taxes, which are going to be dramatically different. So it really involves calculating, the judge sitting here trying to calculate his taxes, federal and Connecticut taxes, when he's 80, 81, 82, 83. The judge can't do that in his head, let alone in a half a second, and get it right, because it depends on, you know, how much the husband as a single person would be saving and how much assets he'll have, and whether he's going to have to pay Medicare Part B, the high income premiums, which maybe the other spouse won't pay. All this stuff gets incredibly complicated, and the judges are just trying to do something, they're guessing. So, but they're knowing in the back of their head that they're guessing, and they're trying to still be fair. And this is like an invaluable tool. If you can say to them, look, here's what we ran, you know, it's, we would make available our software for free to any judge, any divorce judge who would like to use the software. We give it to them for free because we're interested in stopping divorce war. That's where we started with this program. We're not focused on making money. That's not our bottom line here. It's to try and help people. We have 4,000 people getting divorced a day. A lot of this is very, very destructive to the family unit, to the kids. And, you know, we want to make it easier for people. And so if you have a divorce judge, you're in front of a judge and say, please, you know, just let me know and I'll set them up with the judge with the software for free in 10 minutes, 10 seconds. And the judge will be able to see, now I've got a tool I can use to adjudicate cases, even though maybe the parties themselves haven't used the software. The judge might be able to use the software or want to use this. It should want to use the software. If I were a judge, I would want to use the software, no question.
And there was a second half to that question about 7-year marriage, 4-year-old child. Is that?
Yeah, let me see if I can find that, because I think might have moved on and
Sorry.
deleted that part. I think the question though was basically, you know, at what age, how does the program work to calculate, you know, child support and alimony, and I guess
Okay.
you can set the limits, right? Yeah.
Yeah, let me speak to that. The child support, I think most states have some kind of a little calculator for child support, so it's kind of cut and dry. You can use that calculator, plug the number into our software. But AMDS does have an advantage over, over MaxiFi in the following area. It asks how much of the physical time of the child will be spent with this spouse versus that spouse. Who's going to have physical custody? So it might be 40-60. And when the child is with, let's say the husband, we assume in the program that the child is going to have the same living standard as the husband while the child's with the husband, or the dad. When the child's with the mom, the child's going to have the same living standard with the mom. So that's what needs to be paid for, regardless of whether there's any, you know, particular money coming in that's called child support. Dollars are dollars. So the program says, well, look, all the money that the mom is getting, regardless of what it's called, whether it's retirement account money or just more money in her checking account to start with, or the ex is going to pay for the rent for a while, or the mortgage cost for a while. Regardless of how that financial arrangement is set up, whatever they can afford to spend on an ongoing basis, the program assumes that the kids have 70% of the same living standard as the mom when they're together. And that living standard could be lower than with the dad. The dad might have ended up with an agreement where he has a higher living standard because maybe he's going to work longer and earn more, and he's got a really high pressure job. So when we're with the dad, it's 70% of a higher number. So this is how AMDS handles these issues. It just treats the child support as just money, okay? But then it does something I think very important, which says that the kid is, if they're in that household, they're going to have the same living standard as the parent while they're in the household and while they're up to age 19. And that's until they left the household. And that's very important. I think the program actually lets you specify when the kid is going to leave the household. Also, if the kid is disabled, that's another factor that comes into play here.
This question is from Andy, and I'm assuming to Karen. He asked, is it possible to review a mediation settlement after the fact? Can a mediation settlement be altered upon further review or appeal?
So if it's a mediation, if it hasn't been presented to the court, certainly, and there should be some kind of provision in that mediation agreement that talks about modification. You know, it could be that if the two parties agree to change, and especially, I mean, when kids are involved or anything else, things should change as life goes on, and then how to approach it. So there hopefully is something in that mediation agreement, which I don't know if it's a memorandum of understanding or anything else. If it was not incorporated into a divorce situation, it certainly can be modified and probably should be modified, but I'd have to look at the document to see.
Right. This is from Mitch, and I guess it's towards both of you guys. He says, we have been married for 29 years. I have about 5 years left to work. My wife is a part-time nurse and has about 10 years left to retire. I make about 10 times her salary. Other than splitting assets, how typically is alimony estimated? Maybe you want to talk about the differences between alimony and splitting of assets.
I can explain in the sense of course, every state is different, but the assets are usually in one bucket, and the alimony is applicable to the income. So difference of the income, and again, every state has different alimony provisions, and based on case law or anything else of that nature. So I think, Larry, that's more your question too, of how that would be figured out with that differential in work time.
Right. So here again, I think the ratio of the two living standards would want to incorporate if one person is working, the other person isn't, and for how long that person is going to work to compensate that person for maybe working harder and longer. But if you just split the assets, you're leaving out, first of all, one person is going to earn more money, and that might have been, part of what everybody assumed was going to happen back when they got married years ago. And so that's kind of part of the marital assets, the earnings power and length of earnings of each spouse. And then you've got the Social Security benefits that are going to be higher for the husband and who's asking this question because he's had, higher earnings in the past. There will be divorced spousal benefits for divorces that occurred after 10 years of marriage. The program is going to calculate that. If the husband has a maximum age of life that's, 80, they're quite sure for some good reason that they're going to pass away earlier, then the surviving divorced widow would get that person's benefit as a divorced widow benefit. So that's going to come into play and be incorporated in the program. So there are all these factors that go beyond just the assets that have to be taken into account. There's earnings, there's Medicare Part B premiums that could be higher for the higher earning spouse than for the lower earning spouse. And the other thing is that the lower earning spouse in this particular question sounds like they're younger by maybe a number of years. And say they've got a longer lifespan, maybe because they have the same maximum age of life, but the wife here is 10 years younger than the husband. Well, that's 10 years longer that the wife has to sustain herself if she makes it to 100 than the husband. So in some sense, if you're going to equalize their living standard, you want to take into account the fact that one person is younger, and that's actually a disadvantage because they have to support themselves for more years. So that may, if you said we want to keep the same living standard for each person so they can, sustain themselves up to their maximum age of life, that will actually require more money to the person who's younger because they have a longer remaining lifespan. And economics says you need to plan as if you'll live to your maximum age of life because you might. And you can't, it's kind of like, that's the worst case financially speaking, living on and not dying, because every year you live, you have to pay for yourself. Personally, living to as long as possible is a great thing. You're happier, you get to see your kids, whatever, party if you're healthy. But financially speaking, it's a disaster to keep living. And this is, a hard-nosed economist coming at you. So don't freak out too much when you hear me saying things like this, but that's the reality. And so somebody who's younger is kind of at an economic disadvantage, and that also plays into the picture here. So that's why running the program and seeing how much people actually get to live on every year in real dollars, because the program's taking into account inflation, show all the numbers in today's dollars, that makes a lot of sense. So people can see, what are they getting into if they get divorced? And, the two parties can say, look, I'm just not interested in being fair. If we get divorced, I'm going to take you to court. And this is where the judge is likely to come down because we live in Alabama and this is the way decisions are made down here. Well, then the other spouse has to say, okay, then I see that the ratio is going to be more like 0.5 rather than 1. And is it worth it now to give up my living standard when I'm married versus, living at a much lower level? Maybe it is, but those numbers have to be taken into account. So unfortunately, you're kind of stuck with the partner you're negotiating with on both sides. And you try and do the best you can in making an agreement. So people's feelings about equity are going to come into place. Some people think, divorce is just, marriage was just like a temporary period of hanging out together with a spouse, and the kids will take care of themselves, and I have no obligation. We tried it, didn't work out, and we should just go our merry way, even though we've been married for 25 years. Some states might feel that's okay. Other states would say, no, sorry, that's not fair. Especially if one made a lot of sacrifices to their earnings capacity to help the other spouse, or maybe one of the spouses is disabled. That comes into play as well. So I think though that trying to work this stuff out yourself before you get into two lawyers who have an incentive to start a fight between the two parties, because the longer they can keep you fighting, the more hours they can bill, and the more they can suck from both of you to themselves. And so both the lawyers have an incentive to fight and fight and fight and never settle this. So I've seen divorces between friends that have turned into bloody war that have gone on for years, and then it's just a miserable situation. It's miserable for the kids, for both parties. Don't go that way. That's why we built the software, to keep you guys, prevent you guys from ending up in that situation.
And that's another reason to try and think about finding a resolution, whether through mediation or some other way, that you can be creative. Because if one person wants to retire in the next couple of years, the other one, taking those different things into factors, into consideration is really important. How the asset is divided, how assets are divided, how the alimony comes into play, so that both parties' goals can be met.
Yep.
Okay, we have a number of questions here, so we're just going to keep rolling here. This is for Karen. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer this, Karen, because I don't know whether you use family law software, which is sort of the dominant. Yeah, I mean, this is a question from a different Stephen. He's a collaborative financial neutral, and he's wondering, how you found the differences between AMDS or our software versus family law. But family law is sort of the dominant software right now on the market. We've heard from, as Stephen here says, that he finds family law to be very limiting and frustrating in terms of the output. And we've heard that from other people. So I suggest to you to maybe check it out, check our software out and see what you think in comparison. But yeah, let's see here.
One thing just to add to that is, so our focus, my focus as an economist is not kind of, for example, we don't ask in our software what you were spending in the past. That might be a question that the state requires you to fill out some document that says what your living standard, what your expenditures were in the last year or so. But from our perspective as economists, it's really what can you afford going forward, and that's based on your resources, not whether you drove around in a Rolls Royce in the past. That may no longer be affordable. So we're taking this long-term perspective. We're thinking about not just this year, but Social Security benefits in the future, how long you're going to live, giving you a plan for the rest of your life. My understanding of family law software is that it's somewhat static. It's not looking way out into the future of your entire lifetime. And so it's giving you a different perspective. It has certain advantages over our software. I think some of the forms that need to be filled out, family law software is going to make it more convenient to use. I would say maybe think about buying both programs or using both programs with clients, because family law has some advantages, I think, over ours in terms of just the process of getting divorced. But in terms of the process of analyzing what the settlement should be, I'd go with our software.
And on that note, let me ask this question from Tim to you, Dad. He says, we're divorcing after 45 years, both retired with a single pension, Social Security for both, and about $1.5 million in assets. Wife has had a life planner provide medical estimates for future. There is no discussion of insurance coverage, tax implications, etc. Will the program address these issues?
Yeah, you could say, for example, that the wife has an off-the-top expenses for healthcare that are more than the husband. And, if you, after 45 years, you presumably both want to have the same living standard. So you jiggle things around in running AMDS to make sure they both have the same living standard. Their Social Security benefits could be different. Start by dividing the assets evenly, and then maybe think about each person having the same kind of housing going forward, even though they may decide they want to do that differently. And then there might be, in some cases, for a couple that's been, this age, there's not that much uncertainty about a lot of factors. But they're in this case, if they're older, if the husband all of a sudden had to have medical treatment that involved out-of-pocket expenses that go beyond the health insurance, that any out-of-pocket spending on health insurance can be specified as a special expense. But now all of a sudden the husband develops some need for home health care that wasn't there 5 years ago. Well, then the divorce agreement, I would say, should permit a reevaluation of the deal if something major changes financially for either party. I think probably Karen would agree with that. She's nodding yes. So I think, yeah, this is a program that can be used through time. It doesn't have to be used as just once and set everything in stone. But you can also make your agreement say that, yeah, this is where we're going to start, and we're going to look at this whenever there's something major that happens to either party, and that gives both parties some insurance protection that they'll get some help from the other party if things go south for them. And that's and now you recompute saying, okay, this person also has out-of-pocket health expenses, so therefore the some assets should go from this person to that person, or back to that person, or there should be alimony going back in this direction, in a reverse direction, as an example, or less of the Social Security benefit from the higher Social Security beneficiary should go from that person to this person because things have changed.
Okay, this is a question from Craig, and it's to both of you guys. He asks, if I would offer this as a service, would you think the program's use is best positioned as a service to the divorce process, or is it best positioned to represent one side of the divorce? I'm concerned that if I represent one side, the other side would challenge calculations and I would have to go into the program's assumptions. Am I right?
Well, I think you could be used either way. If you have a collaborative divorce here, if you're an attorney or a divorce professional or a mediator, there's lots of different designations, certifications. I think the best would be you run the program for both parties where they're both there in the room, and or you bring them both together and you show them the result. If it's kind of more contentious and one party doesn't feel they're being treated fairly, then showing the other party, look, this is a program that wasn't developed for your to be X, it wasn't developed for Sally, Sam. It's just a program that calculates taxes based on everybody's tax liability each year. So in terms of, we have tax reports, you can see the calculations. We have Social Security reports. They align wherever we can test against Social Security. For example, in Social Security, we test our program against Social Security's own online calculators. They agree to the penny. So we have a long track record. We've been in business for 28 years. So the only thing that we could be getting wrong are the taxes and Social Security. And we have people working full time to make sure, who are really anal, to make sure we have every little detail on those things. For all the 42 states that, including DC, that do have state income taxes, we do those calculations as well. And we are very, very careful about them as well. So yeah, we wouldn't be able to hand you our software code, but you could, look at, the AGI in that particular year and see whether the tax numbers look reasonable. And for the federal tax, we have an explicit breakdown. And if you had some question, you think that the taxes are not incorporating some particular provision in Montana, let's say, we would double check, because we get people, raising questions like this over the years. That's why we have been able to get the software so accurate, because people have said, well, you left out this special break for somebody over 65. And so you're right, we did. We're going to fix it right away. We did. So that's, I'm not saying the software is perfect, but I'd count on it.
This is a question from Bob to both of you guys. And he asks, is the basis, and I can repeat this if it's not clear, is the basis for the idea that the divorcees should not have the same living standard after divorce based on the idea that each one has contributed differently financially during the marriage. So how would you determine it basically for a couple that divorces that, how do you determine them not having the same living standard, or what sort of metric to use there?
Karen, do you have a?
I guess you have to look at all the full picture, certainly, to decide and decipher why one party would have a different standard of living, what the future acquisition might be, what the assets entail, those kind of pieces to get the full picture is what I would.
Yeah, I think it depends. If you've only been married 2 weeks and you just tried getting married, a lot of people get married, divorced pretty soon, pretty early. In that case, the courts say, really divide the assets and walk away. Or somebody brought in a whole lot of assets, probably that person gets to keep most of the assets. And it's like a do-over. If you've been married 10 years, the courts feel this is longer, and there should be some consideration. Maybe one person made a sacrifice for the other person. There's also the issue of taking care of the kids. It may be that the child support that the particular state recommends is not really enough to deal with providing that child the same living standard as the parent who's taking care of the child, which is really what's going to happen in the end. And if they're married 25 years or 45 years, we just heard about a case like that. Well, you would expect that after 45 years, both parties would want the other party to have the same living standard. That would be the notion of fairness. They were together for 45 years. There's a lot of love there, and maybe there's some issues about whatever going forward. They just want their peace and quiet from each other. I don't know, but that's a case where it seems like, through time, the future living standards ratio should be closer to 1. I'm just saying that if you kind of focus on the ratio, you're going to get to something that doesn't. You get to eliminate all these other fights over things that can be resolved by software that don't have to be argued over. And you can, so if you figure out, you say, well, let's look at 1-to-1, let's look at 0.5-to-1, let's look at the other way around. Let's look at what this entails. It might be that the two spouses have pretty similar resources. If you divide the assets, then they have very similar living standards, and they haven't been married that long, so there's no kids. So they just walk away and say, well, we tried. It was lovely, being married to you. Well, we'll just be friends. I'm not going to wrangle or get into a big fight over, $3,000 a year. I'll just go out and earn some more money. You know what I mean? So
Well,
there's no formula for the right ratio. Let me put it that way.
Well, and I want to follow up on that with a quick question from Alex here, because just on that last part you were talking about, he says, I'm a little fuzzy on how the living standards ratio is determined. Does the software help in calculating what the ratio should be, or is that only a matter of negotiation?
Well, I think, I started out by showing what the ratio would be if you just split the assets, and it was, very disparate. The ratio was something like 60%. One person had a living standard 60% of the others, or 50%, something like that. And when you see that and you say, okay, that doesn't feel fair. Now that you start moving to thinking, well, you start with that ratio and you say, well, that's not fair. What would be fair? Maybe 0.75 would be fair, or maybe 1 would be fair. So I think the program helps you think through what's a fair ratio, because it have we taken into account the off-the-top housing, off-the-top medical expenses, for example? So given that, and that's out of the picture, now, should the two living standards discretionary spending amounts that people have be pretty equal? Or should somebody get more because they work so much harder or longer?
So it is more for negotiation. I mean, it's an objective measurement for negotiation.
Yeah, it's going to help you get to a ratio that you feel comfortable with. I can't say that everybody is going to be able to kind of come together on this. A lot of people just like to fight, and or at least one party wants to fight because it's a very emotional situation, and they need to get it out of their system. They need to fight for a while, just to fight, because they feel aggrieved. And so I'm not sure this is going to resolve that issue, but there can be fighting over things that are other than financial things where there's an answer. We shouldn't fight over things where there's somebody says it's X, somebody else says it's Y, and it's actually Z, and in 2 seconds you can figure out it's Z. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay, I want to kick 2 questions over to Karen here. This is from Bob. One is, are there any special considerations for same-sex divorces? And the second one is, are any court fees typically shared equally between the 2 spouses?
Yes, usually the fees are, I'll go backwards. The fees are usually shared. The cost of mediation is usually a joint too, which is an advantage versus litigation when you're hiring your own attorneys. There are, of course, every state is different, but it's the same way for same-sex marriages as other marriages.
This is a question from Richard. He says, is this software good for someone who has been divorced a long time and is trying to get some spousal support reduced?
I would say yes, because you can compare the 2 ongoing living standards of the 2 parties. Maybe the settlement was made assuming, or the alimony was determined assuming the person could continue working and earning $300,000 a year in their restaurant, but now the restaurant went under, right? And so now you could say, okay, let me, show the judge my living standards down here. My ex, who I'm giving all this alimony to every year, their living standards up here. That's not fair to me on an ongoing basis. I would still be working and with the restaurant, but we had COVID and we had to close the restaurant. And the best I can do in terms of getting another job is being a short order cook for this much money. I put that in the program. But our living, so please lower my alimony payments because that's reasonable. That's fair. And then I think the judge would say, okay, well, that's maybe, I guess if I were the judge, I would say that makes some sense. That there was some predication here of the initial deal, initial arrangement. It was all predicated on this person being able to keep the restaurant and work for many years and earn the same salary they had been earning from it. But times change so that we have to really implicitly, we're thinking about a long-term agreement, but we have to take into account that things do change. Now, of course, if there was no alimony, if it was just, look, we're going to go our own ways, we're going to just, the one person would give the other person a lot more of the assets and say, I have a higher earnings, but what our agreement is that I'm going to give you more of these assets so that I never have to renegotiate this again, that it's over and done. I'm in a position to basically buy you off from any future contentious negotiations about anything. I can go my own way. I don't have to worry that every dollar I earn, some of it has to go to you. That can be the way the parties want to resolve things. And then in that context, if you lost your restaurant, that's on you kind of because that was the way you struck your deal. And this person agreed not to come back and ask for more money if your restaurant started to boom. If you turned into a, chain restaurant and became a multimillionaire. So some people want to have things kind of finalized for good forever. Other people are willing to kind of say, look, we need to insure each other going forward, just like we insured each other up to this point, because we're kind of financially tied, and having my ability to pay for you more money when I'm doing well is I'm okay with that. But on the other hand, I want to be able to, rather than giving you a whole big chunk of money right now, I'd like to make it flexible so that if my company goes under, my job goes under, I get to reduce what I have to pay to you. And that may be better really for both parties.
Okay, this question is from Val, and she asks, how often do you see couples running this sort of analysis, and when seeing the negative financial impact of divorce, decide not to divorce? I don't know if you guys have any experience with that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to do with our software. It could be just, are there cases that you've seen, Karen, where, when couples have sat down, looked at the cost of everything and said, it's not worth it?
Certainly, that does happen. Definitely. I think in the last year also with COVID, I think a number of people sort of decided to put it on hold. So that certainly I've seen that.
And just in terms of our software, even though we developed this program probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we haven't really marketed it because we've been focused on the MaxiFi tool and improving it and other parts of our business. So it's really like a hidden gem that nobody knows about. So we haven't had that many people try it out and buy it, or financial mediators or lawyers use it. But so it's really, this is the first webinar I think I've given about this software, and I hope that it will get people interested and they'll try it and they'll give us their feedback, and we'll see through time. And we're doing better as a company so that as more people get interested in the software, we'll start trying to advertise it so we get more and more information about how people are responding to it.
Yeah. This is a comment from Barbara. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but she said, should be mentioned that child support for a disabled adult child must be paid to a first-party trust, or they will not qualify for SSI or Medicaid. Are you guys aware of that?
I do know that, yes, in general, a lot of it will impact services if income. That's, and again, it depends on what is being received, but certainly that's a whole nother area of sheltering certain assets and income to make sure that the benefits do not cease. So.
Right. Yeah, that I wasn't actually aware of that. That's I'm glad I was just told about that. I'm not sure it really changes our software so much as if you said we're going to give this child support, but we're going to do it in this way through a trust, so that the program can also incorporate the SSI. So the kid lives with let's say with a wife, and there's SSI benefits, which would be entered as the special receipt for as long as if this child is permanently disabled, that would be a source of income. Medicaid would also help determine how much additional out-of-pocket healthcare expenses for the child would be incurred by the wife in my example. So I think that's very important information. I'm not sure it changes the design of our program, but I'm glad to hear about it. And we would try and make people aware of this now that we know about it. Clearly, think about something like if somebody takes their Social Security benefits early in order to give their disabled child disabled child benefits from Social Security, that can reduce your SSI. That will reduce the child's SSI benefits dollar for dollar. And our MaxiFi tool knows about that and takes that into account in its calculations. So we ask about SSI there. Just saying.
So questions are starting to die down, or the new ones coming in. Maybe we'll go to the end of the hour here. I have a couple of questions, big questions for Larry that I think we'll just go through quickly. That sounds good. This is a string of questions from Dan, and for you, Larry. Have you seen enough divorce scenarios run through Amds to give an approximate range on the composite reduction in standard of living? Of course, all situations are unique, but roughly how big of a financial hit is divorce? Said another way, what decrease in standard of living coming out of Amds would surprise you on the high side and the low side? And what decrease in the standard of living would be more typical? Thanks.
Well, there's basically two can live for the price of one in the case of housing and air conditioning, electricity, and heating, and dishwashers. So some part of your living standard that's not in terms of your discretionary spending that's connected to your housing goes away. So when you need to go from one house to two houses and pay two property taxes and two heating bills and two homeowners insurance bills. It might be, it could be half, but it's really more two heating bills and two repair bills for the fridge and so forth. That's a hit. But then in addition, there's other things that when you're married, when you're two people, you can share leftovers. You can, if you're pretty close to the same size, you can share clothes. You can share the car. You can go on vacations together and share with a room, right? So we assume in MaxiFi that two can live as cheaply as 1.6 for everything that doesn't have to do with housing. We're kind of implicitly assuming two can live as cheaply as one in the case of housing, but for all the other spending, it's really 1.6 factor. The two can live as cheaply as 1.6, and we show a comparison of discretionary spending and then the living standard per person, which takes into account this factor. So the living standard per person is actually higher than just the discretionary spending divided by two. There's a higher number that comes out in MaxiFi as a separate report. You'll see discretionary spending, but you'll also see the living standard per person that's taking this 1.6 factor into account, which you can change under assumptions and settings. So I think that the answer right off the bat is that there's like a 60% differential here in the living standard for the same discretionary spending. If another way of putting this is if you had each person spending $100,000 on a discretionary basis and they were living together, their total living standard per person would be more like $160,000 each rather than $100,000 each, just by getting together and enjoying those joint economies of shared living. So there's that, and then I think that's the biggest thing. But then there's other things. So that I think I'll stop there. I think I'll say that we're talking about a major hit to people's living standard because of the economies of shared living, because you need 2 cars, because uh, you may be paying 2 health insurance bills, which somehow don't add up to the one that you were paying before. Lots of factors like that, but you'll get to see the bottom line by doing this analysis with these 2 programs.
Here's a question for you, probably Larry, but also maybe Karen can talk about this, her experiences with this. I mean, she asks, how would you best, this is Lori, how would you best use this program if one spouse has wildly fluctuating commission income? You know, how do we think about that situation?
Oh, this for me? Well, I would say
Well, for either of you.
Yeah, I guess my reaction would be that the alimony could be specified as some proportion of the income. If so it could be 70% of the income, or half, yeah, maybe 30% of the annual income is given to the spouse, but if the income's higher, it's a bigger number that's given. If it's lower, it's a lower number. So that's risk sharing across the couple. Or it could be a fixed minimum, but if it goes above some number, then more is paid out as alimony.
Karen, do you have any experience in that, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the software necessarily takes into consideration commissions, but a lot of the times when we're trying to resolve a situation like that is so in flux, when somebody's salary or commissions or bonuses, maybe a percentage is decided on a support piece or anything else taken into consideration, but also an exchange of tax returns on a yearly basis is one idea, just to adjust or figure out, or one person pays for a little bit more of certain expenses than the other. It really depends on the circumstances, but it's hard to decipher an actual number when commissions go all over the place.
Yeah, the other thing I want to say as an economist is that, if you said that 30% of every dollar that let's say the wife earns has to be paid over to the husband as alimony, that puts her kind of in a 30% higher tax bracket, because that's extra. Every dollar she earns, 30 cents is going to the husband. If she's already paying, let's say 37% federal, in California it's 13% is the top bracket, I think, state. And there's a FICA tax of 12.4% plus 2.7% for Medicare. Medicare. So this could put the wife into such a high tax bracket that she doesn't have much incentive to earn money. So the other spouse who's receiving the alimony should be very cognizant of leaving the higher earning spouse with the incentive to earn more money, because it could be, look, if you really strike it rich, if your commissions are really high, at that point, we'll do some earning sharing. But up to this point, what you pay me will not change. Maybe it's going to change for inflation. I think that's very important, that alimony payments should be indexed to inflation, because salaries are likely to rise with inflation. But apart from that, it might be a kind of an optimal tax solution to have no additional taxation until some level, and then it's maybe some lump sum amount. As long as your income stays above this level, it's an extra $10,000 a year, something like that, so that the person who's earning the money always has an incentive to earn more money. Because if that incentive, is there, then again, for a given ratio, this means that there's going to be more resources that the two are going to generate that can then be divided in that ratio, and that means a higher living standard for each one.
Okay, this is a question from Ross, and I would assume it's for Karen. He asks, is the affidavit of support signed in a spouse visa petition in a marriage of is the affidavit of support in a marriage a factor to consider if the spouse is refusing to pay spousal support in a marriage that lasted less than 7 years? Can this document be enforced?
Appreciate the question. Would have to know a little bit more about and actually see the document before I can, certainly can't give any advice.
Gotcha.
But talk to your attorney, talk to somebody local.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's for me. That was all legally, so it does sound like you got to talk to an attorney. Okay. Let's see. There's a couple more questions here for Larry. I mean, this is a good question from Bob, and maybe you just want to provide a quick answer to this, Larry. Can Amds run automatically in an attempt to find ways to maximize the situation, similar to how MaxiFi can maximize a base plan?
It doesn't have any robo-optimization feature, but it's really easy to set up to copy a settlement and then modify it, copy it under a different name, modify it, runs in half a second. So you can do this manually pretty quickly. Like think about taking Social Security benefits later, retirement accounts earlier, as an example.
And this is another question quickly for you. When would you expect MaxiFi and this program and others to be updated to include the tax law changes included in the recently passed American Rescue Plan Act, which was, of course, the third stimulus package?
Yeah, we'll be, we have a kind of a regular schedule for updating federal and state income taxes and FICA taxes. So I think that happens on the federal side. I think we do that later in the spring. So we'll certainly take into account, the change in the child tax credit, for example, that's been in place. We might implement that sooner because we know already everything about it. So that's in my mind that we need to try and do that as soon as possible. And then the question is, was that going to last, that child tax credit, beyond, I think it's just 1 year that they legislated it for. So I think we might need to give options under settings and assumptions that let you continue that into the future versus it ending after 1 year. Just like with the TCJA, there's provisions there that it ends after like 10 years, but then we have in our software, the base assumption is that it does end. We just follow the law. We have an option for letting it continue through the future. So we're going to try and probably do something like that with this Biden policy.
Right. Okay. This question is for Richard. Apologies if we've basically, Karen and Dad, you've already answered this, but he asks if a divorce, well, I guess it's a little different. If a divorce goes to litigation, will the judge look on the results of the software output favorably?
I think it maybe depends on whether they like economists or not. Yeah, Karen, what do you think?
I think it depends on the outcome of the software, what the results were, whether or not, I would definitely think that any kind of information is helpful to the judge to make the determination. So hopefully it will be favorable.
Yeah, I think, this is just, look, here are the resources, here are the two, here's what they get to live on. The judge is trying to find that information out in his own brain. The judge is going to know that this software wasn't designed to help one person versus the other, that the lawyer for this person didn't think that the software was biased towards his client in its construction. So I would think that the judge, any reasonable judge, would say, hey, this is a benefit to my analysis of what's a fair settlement if I have to make a decision. I'm delighted to have it. I would be thrilled to have this if I were a judge, because otherwise you're kind of shooting in the dark with rules of thumb about, and there's no, there's a real reason why the states don't have really determinate alimony rules that are hard and fast. They have guidelines, but even in the, a handful of states, maybe it's 8 states that have guidelines, they're just guidelines. The judge has the ultimate rule if it goes in front of a judge. And so then, the reason they don't have these strict guidelines is because they can't factor everything in. The legislators know that it's too complicated, and the judge has to use his best sense, but his best sense can be informed by really accurate software, or her best sense might be a female judge. So that's my answer. I think the judges would be delighted to have this presented to them, and would probably start using it for all their cases.
Okay.
So,
okay, let's maybe do like 3 or 4 more questions. How does that sound, guys?
okay, sounds good.
Okay. Well, I can answer this one, I think. Bob asks, how would one locate a person to hire who is trained in using AMDS? I don't think we have a list yet of planners who use AMDS. Do we, Larry?
No, we don't. But I would say the thing to do is to use it, and then if you need support, if you need like a special session with one of our folks, we could arrange that for a price. We have expert reviews of MaxiFi for $250, and same for the Social Security tool, Maximize My Social Security. So we could arrange something like that for whoever needs some extra help. And basic customer we're going to provide for free.
Yeah. This is from Mitch. He asks, with the change in tax burden moving to the alimony payer, do you establish alimony based on net value versus gross?
The alimony we're looking at, it's really kind of net after all the tax issues are taken into account, because we're looking at each person's sustainable discretionary spending. That's their kind of play money, if you like, or the money for to live off of, apart from paying their off-the-top expenses, which includes taxes. So I think the right answer here is on a net basis. We're fully, this is one of the reasons you want to run AMDS, because of the change in the alimony, the tax treatment of alimony. The alimony should be different in light of that. For the same divorce occurring this year versus 3 years ago, the alimony should be different to take into account the tax differences. But figuring out exactly how much it should be different is something that the software can do. It's very hard to do it on your own, because if you try and do it on your own, or for a judge to do it on their own, they have to think through all the, maybe in the next 55 years of tax returns in their head. It's impossible. So yeah, our software is really ideal for dealing with this change in the alimony taxation or deductibility.
And here's a follow-up to that from Richard. How has spousal support payments being non-deductible now impacted the determination of what the payment should be?
Well, again, it goes back to your ratio. Because it's not deductible would mean that the person paying the alimony should need to pay less, because their living standard is going to be lower, because they have to pay taxes on the money. They're not going to get this alimony deduction, or it's an exemption from their taxable income. So if the alimony stays at the same level, their living standard is going to be lower, their discretionary spending is going to be lower, and that means that if you're trying to go for a 1-to-1 ratio, and the only thing that's different is the tax treatment of alimony, then you'd want to have the alimony be lower to get that ratio back to 1-to-1, because otherwise it's going to go down below. It's going to be higher for the person receiving the alimony compared to the one who's paying it because of the tax law change.
Okay, so we have 3 questions left here. The first I'll kick to Karen. Again from Ross, and I don't know whether you can answer this again, but we'll see. He says, if I know that my spouse is hiding assets and salaries, can I discuss this in the mediation session?
Yes, you can discuss it, certainly. I don't know, it might derail a few things. It might make sense, depending on who the mediator is, to talk separately, see if there's a way to approach it in the session.
Right. Seems like a bit of a subjective call, but it's something that they could do. Yeah. Okay, and the next question here is for Larry, and then we'll finish it off with a big question from Alex that I think can go to both of you guys.
Okay.
This next one is from Jay. He says, can you use the AMDS software to actually solve for the divorce settlement that matches the fixed living standard ratio given various constraints, or is it more of a guess and check process?
Well, it doesn't automatically solve for it, but it takes you, in the case I was showing, it takes just a couple minutes to set up an alternative settlement and just play around with in this case, I was just playing around with the division of assets between the 2 spouses, just going back and forth. Within a couple minutes, 5 minutes, I had how much of the retirement accounts have to be given from the wife to the husband in this case to produce that target ratio. So it's not an automatic calculation, but it's a very simple thing to figure out just manually. It's very, very quick.
Right. Okay, and this last question is going to go to both of you guys. It's from Alex, and it's this scenario he's set up here. So see if you follow along, and I can just repeat it if you lose track. Take the case of a couple, Colleen and Alex. Colleen took a job to give her a better schedule at a significantly lower pay rate. Alex earns more than Colleen, but Colleen could earn more than Alex if she chose to. Custody is basically split 50-50, but if Colleen's hours are fixed and she can't do things like school drop-off, so Alex ends up doing more. In Massachusetts, does this only come down to equal standard of living for the kids? He's trying to understand if Alex is obligated to pay child support because Colleen chooses not to earn at her full potential.
Karen, take that, and then I'll respond.
There's more to just a straight answer, I think, in this situation, because if it was a joined, if both Colleen and Alex decided that she should take this lower paying job, it's sort of something to be resolved and figured out between the two. Certainly in Massachusetts, the worksheet is based on the amount of time and contribution to the kids. So, just following along the worksheet. But again, I think there's a lot of layers to certainly be resolved and talked through.
Yeah, I would say, if Colleen is earning less money or working fewer hours because she's spending time taking care of the kids, it's one thing. And then, maybe that's not an argument for a higher ratio, higher than 1 in terms of his living standard, the husband's living standard being higher than hers. But if she just doesn't like to work, even though she has the same, let's say, a pretty good earnings capacity, and she just enjoys whatever leisure is a part of people's happiness. And so the fact that if he's working in a job that he's not really thrilled by, it's mundane, he's giving up his leisure, she's getting leisure, So that's kind of part of the consideration, just like if she gets to stay in the house, that's a terrific house, and he's going to be living in a rental apartment because he doesn't want the kids to have to move, and they want to, so she's going to live in the house with the kids for the next 10 years, and then they're going to sell it. That also becomes part of the decision about what's an equitable ratio. And so all these considerations come into play, but, I think, it's kind of a back and forth. Let's try this ratio, see what it implies, see if if we're really comfortable with it, explain why I'm not comfortable with it. Some people might think that it's too low for me, or for you, for the other person. That it's not fair, that I don't want to get divorced and leave you bereft of resources relative to me. I don't think that's a fair deal since we've been married for 45 years, or 30 years, or even 20 years, or even 10. That's not the way I conceive of fairness. So, part of this is the objective reality of their situations, what their earnings capacity is, what the kids' needs are, but then part of it is their sense of fairness. And then part of it is also, there's this kind of outside factor here, which is what the judge ultimately would decide in this particular state. Are you in a state that's conducive to the kind of is supportive of alimony, or basically antagonistic toward it? And the states differ a lot. So since we have maybe a 40 or 50% probability of getting divorced once we get married, people should pay some attention to where they're moving to, after they get married, because basically going into getting married, you should kind of plan with some eye to getting divorced, because it happens so often that it's worth, thinking about that, especially if you're giving up your career in order to give the other person a higher level of earnings, because that's going to maximize your joint income. Then the consideration about what state you're living in, because marriage could go sideways, that becomes really important. So we hope that we appreciate, Alex, first of all, thanks for being such a great moderator as usual. Karen, thanks a million for joining me, because I think anybody listening to an economist for what's going on to about 2.25 hours could need some psychotherapy at the end of that session. And but it's good to have somebody who's really in the practice, who deals with these cases all the time. And I'm more of like a theoretician, and think about this from a 30,000 miles up in the air. But we're both around, and both would love any feedback from you. And certainly our company's here to help, and Karen is to help people with these problems going forward. So thanks again. And
yeah. I was going to say, just because Karen, have any last words?
I appreciate the being invited to speak with you, and know that together, hand in hand, MaxiFi and the software is really helpful to trying to find a fair outcome.
Thank you.
Right. They still need mediators.
Right.
Right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.